Good morning, this is Mr. Albers, and I'm here with my son,
Jacob.
Say hi, Jacob.
Hi.
Is there anything you want to tell the students?
I like rocks and spiders.
Yes, rocks and spiders.
And Harry Potter.
Yay! Yes. All right, but today we're going to talk about the book of Daniel, which could be subtitled The Old Testament Apocalypse. Yes, that's right. All right, so who do you think wrote the book of Daniel? Daniel, that's right. Daniel was a Jewish exile. He was taken out of Jerusalem in 605 BC.
Wait, are these words what they say?
Yes, and he rose to prominence in both the Babylonian and later the Persian courts. He's mentioned by Jesus in Matthew 24. And he wrote somewhere between 605 and 530 BC. So 605 is kind of when the story starts. And he lived quite a long life. He survived the end of the Babylonian Empire and was still around when the Persians took over. And so he had a long run. So somewhere in that, he wrote this book. He does mention the reign of Cyrus, who conquered Babylon in 539 BC.
539.
Very good. Okay. Now, there are a lot of prophecies in Daniel that predict what's going to happen. And so many scholars like to date Daniel later to get around the fact that they don't believe that predictive prophecy is a real thing. They think that this is so specific that there's no way this could have been written ahead of time. It must have been written later. Of course, once we get over the fact that Daniel is a prophet, that God is the God of history, that God spoke the universe into existence from nothing, predicting the future compared to that is small potatoes. So no problem for us at all there. Interestingly, there are a lot of parallels between the story of Daniel and the story of Joseph from way back in Genesis. Think about it. Both of them are prisoners in foreign lands who rise to become second in command by, among other things, interpreting dreams.
Yep. 24, 1.
That's right.
1, 5.
That's right. So, he is writing to Israelites after the exile as somebody who is living in exile himself in a foreign land.
BC.
All right, let's talk about the themes of Daniel. So, first theme is that the Lord, Yahweh, is sovereign. What does sovereign mean, Jacob? It means that he's the king.
Okay, it means he's the king.
He's the king over all world powers and human empires.
And it's true too.
It is true.
Lord.
That's right.
And the king.
That's right. And the Lord, Yahweh, is one day going to set up his kingdom, which will last forever. So the book of Daniel is filled with examples of Yahweh proving that he is in charge. Think about Daniel is in the court of the most powerful ruler in that part of the world, maybe on the face of the earth at that time. And yet, God continually protects him and his friends. God humbles Nebuchadnezzar on multiple occasions, and that isn't just for Babylon. That extends to the Persians when they were in control as well. Some interesting facts. So in the order of the Hebrew Bible, Daniel does not occur among the prophets. He occurs among the writings, or the Ketuvim. You remember Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, the law, the prophets, and the writings. Daniel occurs in that last section. So that's interesting. One of the reasons that Daniel does that, or that this happens, is likely because Daniel is an apocalypse. That's kind of a funny word. Apocalypse is the Greek word for unveiling. Okay? When we think of apocalypse, we often think of the end of the world because there's a book of the Bible that's called Apocalypse, and that's the book of Revelation, which in Greek is apocalypse. So an apocalypse is a revealing. Generally, in an apocalypse, what's happening is not even necessarily the future, although sometimes that's the case, but that God is pulling back the curtain, so to speak, to let you know what's really going on behind the scenes. So think of that scene in The Wizard of Oz, where the wizard, seems to be very flashy and intimidating, and there's, fire and smoke, and then little Toto runs off to the side and pulls the curtain back. That's the unveiling, the revelation, the apocalypse, and then you find out that it's really just a little old man, in a little control booth making all that happen. So in Daniel and in Revelation, you see these great human empires. They look big, scary, intimidating. And yet, when the curtain is pulled back, you find that God is in control the whole time, and that as big and bad as Babylon or Persia or Rome, if we were to go forward to Revelation, seem, really they're insignificant in the grand scheme of things. So, little plug for reading Daniel. Not only is it full of interesting visions and stories, but it is one of the books that Revelation draws the most heavily upon. So if you want to be a good reader of Revelation, the book in the New Testament, you need to read and understand Daniel. And, Apocalypse is not exclusively futuristic, but there is a whole lot of predictive prophecy in Daniel, especially of what's going to happen between the Old and the New Testaments, which we mentioned earlier is one reason why skeptical scholars tend to want to date Daniel later to explain how he could have possibly known that these human empires were going to rise and fall and how that was going to happen. So lots of great, interesting stuff in Daniel. The main question of the book is, how is the Lord, how is Yahweh at work in the rise and fall of human empires? How can God be on his throne when his people have been completely conquered by Babylon, and then they're still there when the Persians come and take over, and it seems like Israel is insignificant on the world stage, and it seems like all these other kingdoms, and that includes the Greeks and the Romans eventually, are dominant, right? And human empires, right? We see human empires in Daniel's time, but we also might want to think of, how does this apply to our time today, right? And in many ways, there are a lot of parallels between the United States as a human empire, as a superpower is the word we use now, and these kingdoms, right? Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, how much control and power they exercised, how big and bad they seemed in many ways, right? So what can we learn about how the Lord continues to work and how we can live faithfully in the midst of such empires? All right, in the timeline of Daniel, 3 main dates to write down. So 605 BC, we've mentioned, is the date when Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were carried off to Babylon. That was actually the first of 3 waves of exile. Jerusalem would not finally fall until 586 BC, about 20 years later. So Daniel would have been in Babylon when that happened. 562 BC is the death of Nebuchadnezzar, who is the foil, we might say, to Daniel through most of the book. He's the one on the throne. He's the one who has the dream of the statue that we'll talk about. He's the one that builds the big image and wants Daniel's friends to bow down to it. He's the one who exalts himself and is basically driven insane, and God causes him to live like an animal for a while. Lots of stories about Nebuchadnezzar. He's the one who conquers Jerusalem and burns the temple down. So he dies in 562. And then 539 BC is another very significant date. That is when Babylon is conquered by Persia. And actually, that happens in the book of Daniel. The famous story of the writing on the wall happens as the Persians are outside surrounding Babylon. And within Babylon, King Belshazzar is feasting, assuming that the Persians are never going to get through his thick walls. Okay, so let's look at the outline, and there's kind of a cool structural point I want to make here. So we start off with the introduction, like who is Daniel, how did he get to Babylon, what's he like? And then we get a middle section of prophecies about the nations. And within this second section, I want you to notice the structure, okay? So we have Nebuchadnezzar's dream, which is of 4 different human kingdoms to come. Then God protects Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Then in chapter 4, we have Nebuchadnezzar's pride and how God humbles him. In chapter 5, we have Belshazzar's pride and how God humbles him. He's the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Then we have a story in Daniel 6 of God protecting Daniel supernaturally. That's Daniel in the lion's den. And then in chapter 7, we have Daniel's dream of the same human kingdoms that were in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And then finally, we have some prophecies that have to do with the future of Israel. Now notice this middle section, chapter 2, verse 4 through chapter 7, verse 28. These are written in Aramaic, not Hebrew. It's very interesting. The introduction of the book is in Hebrew. The end of the book is in Hebrew, but this middle section is kind of its own unit in a different language, in Aramaic. And notice the structure here, right? This is what we call a chiasm. Maybe you remember we've pointed out a couple of different chiasms throughout the Old Testament. This is the way you would emphasize something when you couldn't just highlight it and make it bold or underline it in Microsoft Word, is you would structure it and you would have these bookends and you would have this central idea. So the central idea is God humbles the pride of these rulers of human empires, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Okay, so there's a symmetry. I'm going to switch colors here to show this. There's a symmetry between these central ideas. And then you go one step out and you have God can protect his people. God can protect his people when they're thrown into a fiery furnace or when they're thrown into a den of lions. And then we've got these bookends, right, which is God is in control of what's going to happen. He is not surprised by the rise and fall of human empires. In fact, he's exercising control over that so well that he can predict hundreds of years in advance exactly what's going to play out, and he can use that for his own good purposes. And that's really, a huge theme of what Daniel is about. That God is in control, and that God will protect his servants, and that God can humble the pride of anyone who raises himself or herself up against his reign and his law. So that's basically the introduction to Daniel. Y'all are going to be watching the Read Scripture video and taking some notes on what stands out to you from that. So don't put your guided notes up now. But thank you for watching. Jacob, you want to say bye? Bye! Have a wonderful day.